Everyone, or good afternoon, as the case may be. It looks like I have to unmute myself. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual listening session with the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee. This session is being live streamed on the DNC's YouTube channel. I'm Jim Roosevelt, and I co-chair the Rules and Bylaws Committee, affectionately known as the RBC, which serves as the committee within the DNC entrusted with designing the 2024 presidential nominating process and calendar. I'm joined today by Minyan Moore, who was recently appointed as our new co-chair. Minyan is formerly CEO of the DNC and brings a deep understanding of the work ahead, as well as the technical understanding to support our conversations and decisions. Before serving as CEO of the DNC, Minyan was President Clinton's assistant to the president and director of White House political affairs, where she served as principal political advisor to the president, to the vice president, the first lady, and the senior White House staff. She also developed and coordinated legislative strategy, administration policy, and communications planning with senior White House staff. Certainly looking forward to working with Minyan once again in this capacity, and I would like to invite her to say a few words before we dive into today's session.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jim. I am honored to be a part of this process. I'm clearly honored to be serving with Jim Roosevelt, who is the Dean of Rules and Bylaws. It is an honor to just learn under him. This is my second session as co-chair, and I was able to listen to and proactively engage with the Southern states a couple of weeks ago. It was very educational. They brought good thoughts to the process, and I'm sure with the Western individuals that will be speaking today, we'll learn a lot as well. I'm honored that people thought enough of me to serve in big footsteps. Lorraine Miller, who is a friend, a person who I admire greatly. So I hope that I can do some of the things that her and Jim have done over the years with this committee, be transparent, be open, and be willing to listen to good ideas and new processes. So thank you so much. And I look forward to working with each of you.
Thank you so much, Minyan. And just before we go forward, I want to say happy birthday.
Thank you so much.
Everyone on the call joins me in wishing you a happy birthday.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to turn it back to Minyan. We will both be serving as your MCs throughout this evening's program.
Thank you, Jim. So before we review the RBC's process to date and begin our speaking program, we are joined by a very, very special guest. Not only is he a lifelong Democrat, he is also and always fighting for a better, fairer, and brighter future for every American. As DNC chair, he is a driving force in the success of our party, and he is continually working to build the next generation of Democratic talent. We are honored to have DNC Chairman Jamie Harrison with us tonight. He is a friend, someone I admire greatly. So, Mr. Chairman, the floor is all yours.
Well, Madam Chair, once again, I want to join Jim in wishing you a very, very happy birthday. And thank you again for joining. You've been a mainstay on this committee, but thank you for your new role as co-chair, lending your expertise and your experience to this committee. And we're so grateful. Excuse me. We're so grateful to have you on board.
Thank you.
And hello, folks. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here and for sharing your input and perspectives today. I want to recognize our PAD staff for putting this series of listening sessions together. And again, want to thank Jim for his continued leadership as co-chair, and all of the RBC members for conducting a very transparent and inclusive process. Now, while we won't be making any decisions until our summer meeting, Today is one of several opportunities to provide historical context, highlight important parts of this process, and make sure all of the diverse constituencies that make up our party have a clear window into this process. We'll hear from a variety of speakers today and in the weeks and months ahead. All of us at the DNC, every single one of us, are committed to a process that brings as many voices as possible to the table and that demonstrates our values every step of the way. This process of selecting and determining our presidential nomination process, it's a great opportunity for our party. It encourages states to highlight their strengths. It encourages our states to share the ways that they embody Democratic Party values. And these things give us a powerful chance to highlight why it's so important that we elect Democrats at every level, all across the country. If you didn't understand why this process is so important, just look at the things that are going on now. It is so important that the Democratic Party has the strongest process possible, where we make sure that we reflect the values and the diversity of this great nation. So thank you all again for being here, and thank you for everything that you do for the Democratic Party. Jim Mignon, back to you.
Thank you, Chair Harrison. We really appreciate your joining us this evening and highlighting the important work of this committee and the important input that we're going to get in this listening session tonight. This committee, which Mignon and I co-chair, is entrusted with defining the rules for the party's presidential nominating contest by drafting the delegate selection rules and the call to the convention. The RBC has been meeting monthly to develop the delegate selection rules and a resulting nominating process that reflects the diversity of the party, gives candidates the opportunity to meet voters of all types, and ultimately produces the strongest possible Democratic nominee for president. After the delegate selection rules are approved by the full DNC this fall, each state party will develop its written delegate selection plan. The RBC will review the plan for compliance with the rules, including a rule that dictates the timing of presidential primaries and caucuses. Since 1980, the DNC's delegate selection rules have permitted each state party to determine when to hold its primary or caucus, as long as the date of those contests falls within a predetermined window. Traditionally, the RBC has exempted Iowa and New Hampshire, and beginning in 2008, Nevada and South Carolina, causing a pre-window set of nominating contests. The members of this committee are committed to taking a critical look at all aspects of the nominating process, including how the pre-window states are selected and exempted. To that end, the committee recently approved a resolution that allows the RBC to select up to 5 states to hold early contests based on a set of criteria that includes diversity, competitiveness in the general election, and the ability to administer a transparent and verifiable process. In striving to create a truly inclusive process, the RBC also agreed to hold 4 virtual public hearings in which party stakeholders are given the opportunity to voice their views on the pre-window schedule. The purpose of the listening sessions is to create an official record of input on the pre-window schedule from Democratic Party stakeholders who do not have an official platform to provide their comments, such as at an RBC meeting. These sessions allow our constituencies an opportunity to provide RBC members with insights on how to ensure a diverse, inclusive, and transparent process. And while our speaking time is limited during each session, the DNC has added a portal to its website for all interested parties to submit their testimony for the RBC's review. You'll receive a link to that portal in an email follow-up to this session. Stakeholders like you, representatives from constituencies like SEIU, UFCW, advocacy groups, and others, will all be able to use this form. You may access it at www.democrats.org/2024-delegate-selection-process. I'm going to read that once more, although you will get it in the follow-up email. www.democrats.org/2024-delegate-selection-process. Before we begin, would you like to add anything, Mignon?
Thank you, Jim. I'd also like to acknowledge the team helping facilitate this session. We have the staff of the Office of Party Affairs and Delegate Selection. Office Assistant Jenna Whitaker, PATS Advisor Rick Boylan, and Director Veronica Martinez-Roman. They're all doing great work to assist in these listening sessions. We also greatly appreciate all of the help from our DNC Counsel Graham Wilson and Adrian Levine. This program is also supported by the Association of State Democratic Committees, the DNC's Coalition, Research, Mobilization, and political departments of the Secretary's office. So what that suggests is the full weight of the DNC is involved in these listening sessions. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions about the work of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee, please don't hesitate to contact our team. Now let's begin our listening session. Jim and I will call on speakers who will offer remarks and then answer any questions the RBC members may have for them. Once there are no more questions, we'll move on to the next speaker. So I believe we have our first speaker here, and I get the pleasure of introducing him. I also had the opportunity to work with him on one of his most recent campaigns, Adisa Demisi. Adisa is the former campaign manager for Senator Cory Booker's 2020 presidential campaign. Prior to Booker's presidential campaign, he managed Governor Gavin Newsom's 2018 gubernatorial campaign. He also worked on campaigns for Hillary Clinton, Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama, and John Kerry. Adisa, the floor is yours, and I am honored to have you on this call.
It is good to be here, Mignon. Madam Chairwoman, happy birthday. Chairman Roosevelt, thank you. And Chairman Harrison, good to see you. Good to see everybody. You gave my good introduction, so I won't go into it too much more. I am a veteran of 4 presidential primary campaigns, but I'm also a Californian and a Westerner. I moved out here now 12 years ago and have been practicing politics out here through my consulting firm 50+1 Strategies for the last decade. So I come at this as both a transplanted but proud Westerner and also a veteran of presidential politics. And I have 4 points to make. I'll try to get through them quickly, and I'd love to answer any questions you have. The first is about how the West consumes national politics, which I think is different from other regions. The second is about logistics and the logistical challenges that go along with running a presidential campaign and interacting with the West. The third is about media markets in the West, and the fourth is about diversity. I'll close there. So to start with, how the West consumes national politics, I think for those of you who live out here or from here, I think it's just important to say that a lot of I think the West is generally speaking less engaged with national politics, and it's almost entirely to do with the time difference, which is a not insignificant thing that you all should keep in the back of your mind. The State of the Union starts at 6 o'clock out here. People are still on their way back from work. I've missed it sometimes, and it's my job to pay attention to it. Morning news cycles come and go before you drop your kids off at school. And I don't think it doesn't mean that national politics is an afterthought. It's just that it's consumed differently and at a different pace. And I think what that means for folks like me who are running presidential campaigns is, generally speaking, it takes more for national political figures and national politics to reach voters. It doesn't happen as naturally, and I'll talk about this more in a second, because politics are even more local, I think, out here than they might be the closer you get to Washington, D.C. And for candidates who, like Cory Booker, who may appear to be well known and are relatively well known when we started the race, in 2019, it actually is less so in the West than it is in communities, particularly on the East Coast, but also, again, as the further you get away from Washington. Second piece I'll talk about is the logistics. I cannot stress this enough. Logistics really make a lot of decisions for you when you're running a presidential campaign. Those of you who have worked on it, I see Donna there. Those of you who have run them know this for a fact. Every time we would decide to go west, we basically had to make a decision to give up a day, is the way I would think about it, because of travel. And you know, in a primary in particular, you are not rolling in dough. You are flying commercial, and you are at the whims of the flight schedule. And so we basically had to decide, are we going to take a red eye home and save the working hour days, or are we going to fly in the middle of the afternoon and sacrifice time on the ground in the West? And on top of that, it is, you just have to acknowledge that the majority of the press, the national press certainly, is East Coast based. And so sometimes it was hard to get national press to pay attention to things that we were doing in the West. Look, I understand that half the country lives in the Eastern time zone, but and about a quarter lives in the Mountain and the Pacific time zones. But there were definitely times in 2019 and 2020 where I made a decision not to send my candidate to the West because the flights didn't work, or because I couldn't put them on another red eye, or because we knew other candidates would be in the East, and we knew it was more likely that the press would follow us there. So not a small thing, logistics, and worth saying out loud. Two more points on media markets. I'm sure you guys are going to hear this a million times over the course of your listening sessions, that the cost per point of the media markets matter. They obviously do, but I think it's important to note they matter relatively between the pre-window states. Absolute costs matter, but relative costs, I think, in many ways matter more in terms of this discussion. If one pre-window state has really expensive or inefficient markets, and another one has, you know, more efficient, less expensive markets, obviously you're going to be more and also denser, I should say, also with the density of the Democratic population, if it's in one or two markets as opposed to spread across the state. All of that matters. Not that TV or radio is the be all and end all of these campaigns, but it matters. And in general, Western states actually tend to have, other than California, relatively inexpensive, relatively self-contained within states media markets. I think that is something that, again, important to consider as you guys decide which and how the state should line up. And then lastly, the diversity point. I'm sure every Westerner who speaks today is gonna to speak on this, but I do think the West is qualitatively different from the rest of the country. And I know for Senator Booker in 2019 and 20, it provided a critical platform for learning about diverse communities. And it's not to say that those diverse communities don't exist all over the country. Obviously they do. But I think Western communities, ethnic and racial communities in particular, and I will specifically talk about Latino, API, Native communities, have a political maturity out here that I think is qualitatively different than the rest of the country. And I can say without question, speaking just from my own personal experience, that what Senator Booker learned in Nevada in the Latino and API communities in particular is something that made him a better candidate and made him a better senator now that he still sits there. Whether it's in the West or elsewhere, I obviously know, as Chairman Roosevelt said, that this is going to be a really important factor as you guys make your decisions, and it should be one of your primary concerns, making sure that the diversity of our party is reflected. And I think that in the West, really it becomes, it's more natural. It happens more naturally because we have that sort of natural diversity in our states, but also the political maturity, like I said, of our communities of color are pretty well developed. And that means you have to go learn and court those votes, and you can't win without them. So I will stop there. Again, I'm happy to answer questions. I want to thank Veronica and the team for inviting me, and I look forward to engaging and seeing what you guys do over the next few months.
Thank you, Deuce. Do any RBC members have a question for Ducey? Veronica will tell the names of any members with questions, and after the last question, we'll move on to the next speaker.
Yes, Chair Moore, I see that David McDonald has his hand raised.
Okay.
Thank you. It always takes me a while to figure out how to unmute. You commented on the logistics of getting cross country, which as a Western member of the Rules and Bylaws Committee, I'm familiar with intimately. But I'm curious about the logistics for presidential campaigns about getting around inside the state. I mean, the assumption that just getting across the country to the state is all that's really involved. To the upfront states, we tend to focus on the ability to actually talk to voters, not to television stations. So I'm curious.
No, I mean, honestly, it's a really good point. It's probably a problem everywhere, and not unique to the West, but it definitely matters, and I know that one of the things you're going to consider is airports and flights, but there's also roads and whether we were in the East, the Midwest, the West, you name it. I can't tell you how many times I was in a 2-hour car ride from whatever airport to rural area or city to other part of the city and got caught in traffic, et cetera. But I don't think that's necessarily unique to Western states. I do think that the fact that our media markets tend to be, and our voters tend to be, I think, a little bit more concentrated in the West makes it maybe a little bit easier, but it's going to be a challenge no matter where. And it really is, I think, primarily the time difference. That's the thing that really gets us, is the time difference. It makes the voters engage differently, and it makes the candidates, not every candidate obviously is based on the East Coast, but half the country, as I said, lives in the Eastern time zone. So odds are that most candidates and most voters who are paying attention are going to be engaged in that time difference. And it's 3 hours. It's a lot of time.
I have one follow-up question. Given that we may be changing, or we're moving into a world in which Zoom meetings like this are more common, I'm just curious as to whether it's possible to do a Zoom fundraiser from the plane while you're flying across country.
The internet's not good enough, I bet. Okay. But it's interesting. Obviously, the campaign I ran was before the pandemic. I'm curious to see how it changes. I can't say it's not the same doing, whether it be voter contact, fundraising, you name it over Zoom than in person. It's just in person is always going to be better. But will it provide some more flexibility to say stay in the West a little bit longer, so that that was one of the big things we would often think about, is like, okay, if we're going to go to the West, we need to stay in the West and get on West Coast time and spend a few days, and you're foregoing things in the rest of the country and making it harder when you get back. So could you stay a little longer and do more things that are into the Central and Eastern time zone? Maybe now, in future primaries, the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm seeing no further questions.
Perfect. Jim, we'll move to you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chair Moore, I do see a question in the chat now, if I can read it out loud, from RBC member Donna Brazil.
Okay.
She says, question, the DNC has held several national conventions out West. What impact did those events have on expanding our Democratic base and electorate? Secondly, Nevada was added to the pre-window calendar in 2008. Should the DNC give consideration to other states out West as we're doing through this process? And if so, why? Lastly, how can Dems improve chances of winning out West, especially in the midterm cycle?
Well, that last one's going to be hard to answer, but I can answer the first couple. I definitely think that going back to my point about the press, not engaging the national press, at least being harder to get them to the West, anything that pulls them to the West, debates, conventions, forums from our allied organizations, et cetera, we could build around that, which actually was very helpful, and that's true in other states as well, right? But so I think the answer to that question is, yeah, you obviously have a million other considerations when it comes to the convention, et cetera. But I do think that having those anchors out West that forces coverage changes the calculus of people like me. In terms of other states, I don't want to talk, specifically about other states. I think that's not my place here, but I think that the thing I think about Nevada, and I think about the West in general, is our states, with the exception of California, are relatively small relative to, population-wise, and relatively, like I said, the Democratic populations are relatively dense. And I think both of those things make things logistically, frankly, easier and lend themselves towards good campaigning for the reasons. Some of that is answering the question that David asked, and some of it's back to what I said. So look, do I think we should have a pre-window state in the West? The answer to that is 100% yes. I don't really have an opinion about the specific state it should be, but there is something unique about our region, I think, and we do fit in terms of all the practitioner type things. I think there are states that fit what make it easier to run a campaign. Thank you. Thanks, Mignon. Thanks, Jim, and really it's been a pleasure. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was really informative. Thank you.
So our next speaker this evening is Clara Pratte. Clara was Joe Biden's campaign director for tribal engagement. She founded Strongbow Strategies to help tribes across the country with economic development and technology issues. Along the way, she has picked up numerous accolades, including being named one of Native Business Magazine's top 50 entrepreneurs and the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development's 40 Under 40, as well as the 2020 Pritzker Emerging Environmental Genius Awardee. We are so honored to have you here today with us. Clara, please take it away.
Thank you, Chair Roosevelt. It's an honor to be here. And thank you, Chairwoman Moore, and happy birthday to you as well. Thanks, everybody, for your time and attention this evening. I wanted to, almost echo a little bit of what Adisa said in certain areas. As mentioned, I did manage the tribal outreach for the Joe Biden campaign and some special considerations for Western states as we look to this process and really applaud the transparency of this process. Some things to consider specific to the tribal community in Western states. When you look east of the Mississippi, the fact of the matter is tribal populations are much smaller than they are in the West. So as we go forward in this process, really keeping in mind tribal populations and their impact on elections, we certainly saw that in the state of Arizona. We saw that in other areas around the country. Keeping those at the forefront of your strategy moving forward is really critical. I was just pulling up some numbers a moment ago, and as a good example, less than 1% of the population in New Hampshire is tribal. However, 20.26% of Alaska is tribal. Nearly 20% of Oklahoma is tribal. Over 10% of New Mexico. Arizona, huge tribal population, approaching double digits as well. And special considerations to keep in mind with these populations are all the same considerations you would keep in mind with any community of color. But I put an asterisk on that because there are 574 federally recognized tribes. I wish we could have 574 specific outreach plans for each of these tribal communities. And in an ideal world, we would, because we're talking about cultural differences, language differences. One thing that we found to be very effective on the ground was ensuring that our media strategy was very specific to these tribal populations, including radio ad and, where available, newspaper buys in that specific language. It's some of the complications are also compacted by the fact that many of these languages it's more difficult to find native speakers outside of that community. So these insular communities speak the language internally, get the radio in that language, get newspapers sometimes in that language, but finding other people outside of that market that understands that niche to say, okay, here's an ad that's going to work well is increasingly difficult. So trying to get ahead of that on the front end. The most effective is to get on the ground. And it was previously mentioned before, the logistics that are difficult in that process are compounded when you get into tribal communities. We're in some of the most remote and rural areas, sometimes without passable roads or infrastructure, sometimes without internet service, which is why radio maintains to be one of the most effective outreach methods if you're not going to be boots on the ground face to face. Even in the face of COVID, we saw voter turnout rates in northern Arizona 12 to 13% higher than the previous presidential election. And we really count on the grassroots effort that took place during that time, which included media, as much safe in person as possible. We did do some tabling with the local campaign movements, things of that nature. So in person, face-to-face is always best. If that's not possible, finding surrogates that can speak on behalf of candidates within those communities, really critical. It's been one of our most effective strategies, is finding folks from inside of the community that are there, that literally speak the language. Another thing that we found that was very interesting, particularly as you move further out west, is that really politics are very local. It was very common to get folks that split party based on issues, depending on the issue at hand. So they may vote very conservative for a local state rep, but then on the national scene, they vote very progressive, and kind of getting an understanding of how to reach those voters that may be looking at different issues. A huge issue in the West, of course, would be gun control issues, something that we see here in the farming and ranching communities. We also see land status is a very big issue in some of our farming and ranching communities. Over half of the state of Arizona is considered in some way or shape or form public land, and that includes tribal land that's held in trust for tribal communities. So, all of these things create for very unique environments where we have to tailor our strategy and our messaging to these communities. Another thing that I had a lot of feedback about in terms of communities of color is taking a monolithic approach to communities of color. It's like, oh, well, we're targeting Black and brown voters. What does that mean? Black and brown voters are not a monolith. You can't say we're targeting Black and brown voters. We need to parse those out. The African American community in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area is going to be very different than the tribal Native community in Coconino County, and really taking that approach. I kind of find it's interesting as we take the United States and lay it over Europe, and we do a size comparison, the true map, the true size. Going from Arizona to Washington, D.C. is the same distance-wise as going from south of France to Western Ukraine. That's a huge amount of land and the differences to cover in that span of time. So the logistical issues are really real. It was a challenge to get our constituencies to really understand the challenge of bringing a candidate to Maricopa County, Phoenix, the metropolis, and the challenge of getting them up to Coconino County, which is just right here. It's just right here, so people would think. But the logistical challenge of bringing them up into Coconino County, bringing them into Nevada, bringing them into other states, what that poses for these large campaigns, these large moving machines, is something that I think helping to frame the timing issue around is really important. And I think, Mr. Demisi really brought up some great points about the timing. It's called the DC bubble or the East Coast bubble for a reason, because the hour differences really do play a large part in reaching the constituency out west and making sure that we don't, I always say there's more to politics than Washington, D.C. Don't forget about us out here in the West, and a lot of times we do miss things because we're still at work or still doing something because we're still in the middle of our business day when things start on the East Coast. So those were really valid things that were brought up. But I think particularly with Indian country, the rural nature, you've got language barriers, you've got cultural barriers. You also have, in a lot of ways, an inherent mistrust of government in general, and, rightfully so. So we're dealing with a lot of barriers. But when we move further out west, you're talking about double of the margin of error, double of making a county winnable or not winnable. And, I think it is, let's see, a third of the Native population is not registered to vote. So we're talking 1 to 10 percentage points out a turnout for registered voters that are registered, and even a third of the non-registered are still not registered and eligible. So we've got a lot of work to do in tribal communities in building that bridge to overcome those barriers. And so those are just sort of some of the lessons learned, little quick lessons learned from the presidential campaign, and happy to answer any questions in that vein at all. And apologize for my raspy voice. It's a pine pollen season out here.
Great. So Chair Roosevelt, we do have a question from Donna Brazil.
Donna, please go ahead. Donna, you may be muted.
I submitted my question to Veronica. So Veronica, I forgot what I put, but I think, Clara, first of all, thank you for your presentation. One concern I have is, the language barrier. We know that because the Voting Rights Act has been weakened in so many important areas, language barriers. You mentioned also some of the cultural barriers, but how well are we doing as Democrats and also as Americans in general, and making sure that we provide, materials in various native languages, and we also improve access through that process?
Thank you. That's a really important question, Ms. Brazil. I think as a party, we're doing much better than we have been. I don't know of a presidential campaign that had previous to the one we just went through, where they provided, at least we had, I think, about 10 different tribal communities where we had ads specific in native languages, or at least targeted ads. And it was interesting. There was a newspaper out in Arizona called the Navajo Hopi Observer. It's been around since the 1940s. We did an ad buy there, and the publisher said we've never had a presidential ad buy in our newspaper ever. So I think we are getting better, but there remains work to be done. Some of the suggestions that I think have been really helpful is to look at the communities where we still have high speaker percentages. So we've identified those previously in terms of in which communities do they still speak these languages as the primary language at home, and then targeting those communities specifically with ads and media buys in that specific language has been a very effective methods for outreach. Getting a little bit more as a trusted entity, a trusted party within Indian country is going to take more time. And I think it's a matter of boots on the ground and building that one-on-one relationship as much as we can. I'm really excited through the caucus work to hopefully be going and doing more in-person things as we get out of pandemic mode. And there really is no better way than shaking hands with grandmas and grandpas across Indian country. And, in other roles, I've been able to do that. And I'm hoping that we can get our membership to continue to kind of do that specific outreach as well.
Thank you, Clara. And I hope you share with the DNC some of those ads, some of the sample ballots and other material that we can share across the country to every state so that we know that this is part of our best practices for 2024. So don't let it hide in your basement the way I let stuff hide in my basement. So please share it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you.
Any more questions, Veronica?
No, I see no further questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Clara, for a very helpful and interesting presentation. Mayan?
Thank you, Jim. So our next speaker is Bill Burton. Bill Burton is a political consultant and communications strategist who served as Deputy White House Press Secretary in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2011. Bill is the founder and president of Bryson Gillette, a political and strategic communications firm based in Los Angeles. Bill, thank you so much for being with us today. We know how busy you are, so this is an honor to have you with us.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here. And looking around at the names and faces, Jan and Donna and Elaine, Mary Beth, there's so many people who I've respected and looked up to and been friends with for so many years. It's great to see Jason. I see you here. Bryson Gillette, my firm, we started a couple of years ago. We're now like 30 people around the country, but it's named after two streets in Buffalo, my hometown. And there's a buffalo in the logo because my hometown is very closely identified with, I very closely identify with my hometown. I just want to make note that, it's a community that is suffering from a terrible tragedy that happened this weekend. And it's very much on my mind and in my heart. So shout out to Buffalo. So I am here today to talk a little bit about the West. why I think it'd be a good idea for the West to have one of the pre-calendar contests, at least one. And I've got 5 reasons for it. Number 1, I'll go through them and then I'll go through them again. Diversity, the core urban areas, the mix of voters, voter access laws, and then pre-work for the general. Now on diversity, I think if we are going to be committed as a party to diversity, and I know that we are, it's certainly reflected in the folks who've been hired at the DNC, and it's as a committee, the DNC does a better job than any of the other party committees, and certainly better than the campaigns of having diverse workforces and people and consultants and whatnot that they work with. But I think that if we look at the diversity out West and how the population is growing and the areas of diverse communities that are getting bigger and bigger, and to Clara's point, it's not a monolith, right? I think the way you run your campaigns in diverse communities of color is different depending on where you are and who you're communicating with. But I think that if we are focused on it, if our presidential campaigns are focused on that diversity and that growth, it is going to be just better for the party, better for our nominee come the fall. Part of that is my second reason, that's those core urban areas. I think that most Americans live in cities. Many of our voters live in cities. And I think that if we are building campaigns based in some of these core urban areas, as opposed to places that are not quite as urban, less smaller populations, more rural focused, it's not going to be as reflective of who voters are in the country and who we're going to need to speak with in the fall. But third reason, the mix of voters, it's not just urban areas, right? Like you take any one of these states in the West and you've got at least one, maybe more urban areas, but also very healthy suburbs, very healthy exurbs and rural populations that, I think help to fine tune the campaigns for the mix of voters we're going to need in the battleground states in the fall. Number 4, in the West, we have some of the best voter access laws in the whole country, right? Whether it's mail-in ballots, voter registration, ID laws. I think, first of all, it's probably worth rewarding some of those states who have done the work to make voting easier for Americans. But also, I think that it could lend itself to a more successful contest, just in the counting of the ballots and the execution of the actual primary. And then finally, I just think that when you look out West and you look at the mix of states, some of those states where they haven't had an early primary contest are going to be very important in the battleground for the general election in the fall. So getting out there, having a bunch of campaigns who are all doing, or just one major national campaign, likely nominee, doing the work to register voters, have the most accurate sets of data, have the connections with the community that you can use in the fall. But then also inspiring, a new state full of political operatives to come up through the ranks. And as I mentioned, these are diverse places with great young talent that if you stick a primary in their state, we're going to be helping to grow the great young talent in the Democratic Party. And I think that that's something that we really ought to consider. So those are my top reasons. I worked in a lot of presidential campaigns. I'm no down in Brazil, but I did start, my first presidential campaign was the one where she was a manager for Al Gore, and Dick Gephardt and John Kerry and President Obama in the first campaign, Priorities USA in the second, Joe Biden this last one. And so, this is something that is near and dear to my heart, the process, getting the best candidate and, doing everything we can to win these fights that are more and more existential around our democracy. So thank you so much for giving me a minute to chat with you. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
I see one hand from David McDonald.
Hi, David.
David, you are muted.
Sorry, switches crossed again. This may not be, this is a bit of a complicated question, but you may be one of the people that could give some guidance on it. It strikes me that one of the most pervasive and potentially tricky issues throughout the whole Western region relates to water. Who gets it? Who gives it? How does it get divided? And I'm curious as to whether there is a state or states where you think all sides of that issue are best represented so that the candidate going in early gets educated on all the nuances of an issue that may come back to haunt us in the general when we're dealing with what's at this point, I think, the second largest block of electoral votes in the Western region.
Great question. And, I really only know about water issues in California and the many dozens of water districts that we have here and the way that they interplay and the different ways we ship water around the state. And I know that it is complicated here. I would worry, I know that California isn't in the mix for being one of the early states, so I'll say this without bias or prejudgment, but I think if a candidate were to come here and get bogged down in water issues, it could potentially lead to challenges later on. Like, it'd be great for that candidate to get smarter about it and fine tune the message in a way that works state by state. But it's such a hyper local issue that getting it right, to your point, David, and understanding the nuance around having a message that's big enough to fit in all the different states is would be the thing that would be helpful for a candidate.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions.
All right, then I'm off to baseball practice for my boy. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Bill. Jim, I'll send it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Mignon. Our next speaker is Michelle Mayorga. Michelle has spent nearly 2 decades recruiting for, managing, and working on Democratic campaigns and on progressive issues and in local and national administrations. Her clients have included Democratic candidates such as Representative Colin Allred, Representative Pramila Jayapal, and Representative Veronica Escobar, as well as advocacy and nonprofit groups like the Sierra Club, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Bold PAC, and Planned Parenthood. Thank you, Michelle, for being here today with us. Please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me and for considering some of the Western states. You heard a little bit of my bio, but just to make it perfectly clear how biased towards the West I am in general is, I've been the Western either field or political person at the DNC, the DCCC, the AFL-CIO, all the letters of the alphabet. I have worked in the West for them or with them. I've run, campaigns in many of the states, New Mexico, Alaska, Nevada, Montana. I don't know if we're counting Texas as Western, but also Texas. So I super appreciate you all listening to us today. I am also coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And, we have here in New Mexico the largest wildfire in the history of our state today. And so, these issues are very, very paramount here. And there are issues that are specific to the West, and they affect us daily and deeply. But a few things that I do want to talk about and a few reasons that I think the West is a wonderful place to consider is in particular our diversity. I do specialize in working with diverse and women candidates. I specifically also work a lot in the Latina community. And, we have seen the states out West grow more diverse, since I think maybe, since around 2006 or so, and we've seen with that diversity a shift in the states getting a little bit bluer, states like Colorado and Washington and Oregon and New Mexico. I saw Donna Brazil is on, so I don't need to tell you how close New Mexico was in the presidential election in 2000. And today, it is a pretty solidly blue state. And these are states that are, growing in diversity. And we'll talk a little bit more about the diversity down the line. We've also seen new states come on as important target states in the West, states like Nevada and Arizona, where we do have growing populations and growing, again, diverse populations. We're even seeing this in Alaska, which I think is like the next big state to sort of grow and be diverse and be potentially within the Democrats' sights, hopefully. And understanding, in particular, Latino populations is key to the West. I think we have a very interesting history in the West, in that we have there are Latine in the West that have lived here for 17 generations. And then we have also new immigrants. And we have a very, very diverse culture and population throughout the West. And we also have, I think of the 3 Gs when I think of the Latina community. So geography, generations, and gender. And geography, we talk about a lot of times urban Latine communities, but we do see throughout the West also rural Latine communities. And these are areas where, frankly, as Democrats, we have work to do. We are still winning there, but we are losing ground in a lot of these traditional rural communities. And we are lucky to have Democrats and candidates locally who speak to these populations. And it is something that I think we need to be attuned to, focused on, and listening. And then we also, as I spoke a little bit about generational differences in the Latino communities out West, but in particular, we do have communities like Pueblo, Colorado, or in New Mexico, where these communities have been here for 400 years, 500 years. And then we also have communities that are full of new immigrants who have recently come here. And, one thing that we know is from polling, I am also a pollster by trade, is that, first generation new immigrants do tend to be, at least out West in the Western states, do tend to be a little bit more democratic. These are groups of people that we can engage and get involved in, the primary process and involved with Democrats as they become new citizens. There is also a growing population of young people. To be young out West is to be diverse in a growing way, and engaging these young populations, engaging these young people is a great opportunity out here in the West. And then we also have obviously a lot of other diverse communities. I think our Native communities, we often think of, and you heard a lot more about this from somebody who's a lot more, but we often think of, Native communities on Native lands, but there are also urban Native, sorry, I'm getting a waiting room notification. There are also urban Native populations to engage and to look at and to talk with. The West has significant Black populations. We have a long API history in the West, and not just in California, in Nevada, in Montana, throughout the West. And the other piece that I do want to also talk about, something that is, I think, also exciting a lot of young people, particularly recently, is we do have very strong union cities in particular out west. Again, putting on my pollster hat, being able to talk about good jobs and good pay is always a good thing for us. And, we see those populations in Las Vegas, we see them in Anchorage, very, very prosperous places for us to sort of go in and continue those conversations in a primary. I think that's my basic point, other than, and I think that Bill made this point also, but having these states with these diverse populations also means helping develop political operatives who are diverse. And as somebody who has worked on a lot of campaigns where I've maybe been one or two, women of color on the campaign, that is a personal goal of mine as well. But I'm happy to take any questions.
Hello. Yeah,
do we have any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions so far.
Okay, well, thank you, Michelle, for a very insightful and enlightening presentation, and we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Mignon, back to you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Keith Umamoto. He's a DNC member. He has been on the DNC, I think, maybe as long as I've been on the DNC. Keith is a friend to the DNC and to all the members out west. He serves as a board member of the California State Retirees. He is the former chair of the AAPI Council, as well as the Credentials Committee. Keith, we're delighted to have you present tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, and happy 29th birthday to you, Chairwoman Moore.
Thank you. I accept.
You accept, the great. And again, good afternoon, Mr. Chair Roosevelt. And thanks so much for conducting this listening tour throughout the country, and particularly having one in the Western states, because oftentimes the West feels neglected in terms of a lot of the operations. And really appreciate this opportunity. And what was stated about me, yes, I'm a former member actually of RBC, and then also former or current secretary and founding chair of the AAPI caucus, and the former co-chair of Credentials, and former male vice chair of the Western Regional Caucus. So as everyone knows, these midterms and the 2024 elections will determine the future direction of our country, as we've heard from the chair of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee and his 11-point agenda, basically calling for the sunsetting of all federal programs in 5 years. We're talking about eliminating OSHA, Medicare, Social Security, and how many of those infrastructure projects are going to have to be either interrupted or killed because if the Republicans take control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. So specifically, they talk about taking away freedoms. Well, guess what? It is our freedoms, more freedoms that the Republicans are seeking to take away. So that is how significant this election and the 2024 election are in terms of what we do. And we can make a difference through the RBC, through the DNC, and achieving victories in both the midterms and the 2024 election. So when you look at that, in reference to this listening tour, to hear about the critical issues and some of the rules, clearly RBC has rules on the delegate selection process that the states are supposed to identify outreach efforts to our constituencies, whether it be affirmative action, et cetera. And then how many of those efforts are seeking delegates? And those delegates when doing that outreach effort, are going, or potential delegates, some that don't even become delegates, are going to be involved in the 2024 election, or even before, if states begin that kind of process immediately. So looking at the AAPI caucus as a focus point, the caucus in the 2020 and 2021 elections, the growth was tremendous from prior elections. And in addition to that, the chair of the DNC has clearly said that had it not been for the API vote, Biden would not be president today, or we would not have the U.S. Senate at 50-50 and enough for the majority. If you look at the AAPI vote in Georgia, in Arizona, in Nevada, etc. So anyway, giving you a different kind of perspective, there are from the 2020 census, there are 24 million Americans who identified as AAPIs, representing 7.2% of the national population. Well, that in itself is tremendous. But when you also look, it is the fastest growing population. It's almost 40% more than it was in 2020. And then when you project out to the 2022 midterms, we're looking at probably 1.3 million more AAPIs. Then you look at 2024, it will be another 1.3 million AAPIs. What percentage of them are actual voters? Right now, I don't have that specific data. I haven't nailed it down, but that's a significant amount. And then when you look at the history, the AAPI vote as an example. In 1992, President Clinton, you're probably not going to believe this, the AAPI vote for President Clinton 1992 was 31%. Al Gore, and we could thank in part the campaign manager for the Gore campaign, it became 54%. John Kerry got 56% of the AAPI vote. Barack Obama, in his first election, got 62, and then in 2012, 73% of the AAPI vote, and Hillary Clinton got 75%. Now, in 2020, it was significant. It was 2-1 for Biden over what's-his-face, representing 68% of the vote. So you could see the trend, but you also could see a potential ceiling, and that is why it's so critical. Like other speakers before me have indicated, to keep on pressing the issue with their constituencies. And just in reflecting upon the 2020 and 2021 elections, you look at some of the states that were won by literally a percentage point or less than a percentage point. Ossoff and Warnoff, and how close their races were, the AAPI community delivered for both of them. And in the West, less publicized, Arizona, Nevada clearly went for Biden and also went for Kelly. And then, 4 years ago or 6 years ago for Cortez Masto. At the same time, you look at that 60% rate that Joe Biden received. We're looking at what were the flipped districts that went from blue to red in 2020. 2 of those seats were won because the Republican Party recruited AAPI Republicans to run, and some of the AAPIs in those respective districts voted for the Republican because of their affinity to voting for one of their own. So this really accentuates what was demonstrated in a lot of polling. AAPIs, probably 1/3, do not identify at all with a party. So they could easily flip. At the same time, we have been successful, and the focused effort that the party has done has proven so. And when you look at, and a clear example is the 2020 election again, the DNC, the AAPI caucus, the Biden for president, we had 20 AAPI affinity group efforts to do texting and phone banking to their respective constituency. If you do Google Facebook pages, Japanese Americans for Biden, Chinese Americans for Biden, Philippine Americans for Biden, we got 20 of them, and each and every single one of them were doing texting and phone banking, not necessarily in their own state, but with their own, whether it be Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, South Asian, Korean, and that effort clearly works. So again, when you look at what the RBC can do, clearly the outreach component of the rules, to the degree that you could put more meat into what states do in outreaching, yes, the AAPI community, but also all the constituent communities, the affirmative action plans, the inclusion goals, etc. And similarly, as all those on the RBC know, the affirmative action and inclusion program are just goals. There is nothing that requires a state from achieving those goals. They are supposed to certainly do what they can to achieve it, but to what degree, we do not know. So I currently recommend that the RBC look at ways that we could count some language that would put more meat behind both the outreach component and achieving affirmative action and inclusion goals, because if we do that, we win. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and happy AAPI Heritage Month.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Jim. That was very, very interesting. And as always, you always enlighten us just a little bit more. Happy AAPI month as well.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks, Keith. It's great to see you. And thank you, Mignon. Our next speaker is Bill Carrick. Bill is a strategic and media consultant for candidates and ballot initiatives in California and nationally. The founder of Carrick Consulting, Inc., his clients have included Senator Dianne Feinstein's campaigns for governor and U.S. Senate, LA Mayor Eric Garcetti, and former President Bill Clinton. We are excited to have you with us tonight, Bill. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Jim, very much. And also my obscure parts of my resume, I was a member of the Hunt Commission a long time ago with Chairman Roosevelt, and also on the Clyburn-McCaskill Commission during President Obama's administration, dealing with a lot of these very same issues. Let me start with what I pitched for the West. The West is a uniquely diverse area of the country. I think one of the things that we've learned from the Nevada experience is our candidates learned how to campaign in the West in the process. Now we have 5 states that we cannot secure the presidency with if we don't win them: Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, and probably Arizona. So that is something you have to face. We have a serious political base in the West, and we need to reinforce that and expand it. It is also an extremely diverse area of the country, more diverse than any other part of the country. Latinos, AAPI, African American. It's rural, urban, suburban, every trend that is happening in American politics happens in California. Every single trend you can imagine. The growth of the Democratic Party nationally is corresponded with the growth of the Democratic Party in California, going from Ronald Reagan to a safely Democratic presidential state. So I think that when you consider the calendar, you need to consider the West. Obviously, Nevada has been a good experience for us. And I think that that would help us, our candidates, to learn how to campaign in the West. Learn all the things that are different and unique, and learn some of the things that are like other parts of the country. But I think it's a very strong learning process for presidential campaigns to campaign in a part of the country which is so critical to ultimately an electoral college victory. I would say the other issue, one of your things you're going to consider is competitiveness. Are the states competitive both inside the party and in the future in the general election? I think the Western states are truly competitive. They're not. There's not going to be somebody who's going to run away with the campaign. Everybody's going to have to earn it in the West. So any of the consideration of Western states, I think competitiveness is a very strong asset and attribute on competitiveness, which would help our campaigns not only in the primary season but in the general election. Let me now. I'll just say a couple of things that are more general than just the regional. I think one of the biggest things you're going to have to deal with is what do you do with caucus states in the modern political climate and modern medium climate, and that is going to be a difficult decision. But I think you have to consider: can we actually run a first class, under the microscope of the national media and the entire political universe in the country, can we run first-class campaign in caucus states in this modern time and in 2024? That's going to be a very serious challenge. I think the other thing that's a challenge is, can we have party-run primaries and caucuses as opposed to government-administered process? It's increasingly clear. It is the complexity of the process is very difficult for state parties to handle by themselves, and that is going to have to be a very serious consideration in your deliberations. The other thing that I would encourage you to think about is expanding beyond just the states that we have outside the calendar, and consider at least 5 states for that process. I think we've changed. We're no longer the Iowa caucuses months and months away, or several months away from New Hampshire, where a candidate like President Carter did goes camps out somewhere for over a year and organizes a state. That we don't do that anymore. The compression of the calendar has brought all the states very close together, and that is something you got to think about. Okay, more states would probably not create the thing that was feared by earlier commissions and the earlier RBC deliberations, which was that, okay, you can't, if you don't have the states separated, you're not going to create the opportunity for somebody to start off and build a campaign as an outsider. Well, we don't do that now anyway. It's not happening. The campaigns start earlier. The fundraising is much more aggressive and dramatic, and it does require us to think through this whole process. And is it a different world we live in now than it was in the 1970s and 80s? And I would say one final thing that I think is really important is the coalitions we build in the primary season are fundamental to what we have in the general election. And I think that you should keep your eye on the ball. Whatever the process does to encourage people to build good campaigns in contested states, swing states in the general election, that is an imperative that you should consider. With that, turn it back to you, Chairman Roosevelt.
Thanks very much, Bill. It's great to hear your voice again. Enjoyed it in the past. Look forward to doing it again in the future. Veronica, do you have any questions for Bill?
I don't see any questions, no.
Well, Bill, you definitely raised some tough issues for us. We know we have them confronting us, but you confirmed the importance of them. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Great to see you too.
So I will jump back in here now. We are now joined by Professor Seth Masket. Seth is a professor of political science and the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. He studies, I think they highlighted me over your bio. He studies political parties, campaigns, and elections, and state legislatures. He contributes regularly to 538, Mischiefs of Faction, and the Denver Post. He is currently working on a book project examining the Republican Party's interpretation of the 2020 election and its preparation for 2024. And I hope that you will give us some insight or an early look into that process. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Professor Masket. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair Roosevelt, and of course, very happy birthday to Chair Moore.
Thank you.
So I think what the Rules and Bylaws Committee is undertaking right now is quite dramatic and important, and one of potentially the larger changes to the presidential nomination system in more than 50 years. And it's an honor to be invited to weigh in on this matter. In the fall of 2020, my book, Learning from Loss, The Democrats 2016 to 2020, was published by Cambridge University Press. This book was a culmination of a great deal of research following the 2016 election, including a great many interviews I conducted with Democratic Party activists and leaders. I spoke to several of the members of this committee, and some of your quotes actually made it into print. In this book, I was trying to understand the election narratives that prominent Democrats were generating and believing about why the 2016 presidential election came out as it did. People I spoke to had a great many beliefs about why Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump and what the party should do differently in the 2020 nomination cycle as a result. Perhaps the most important consensus explanation of the 2016 election was that there really was no consensus explanation, and there really still isn't. This helped to create an environment in which more than 24 candidates comprising the most diverse field of candidates in the party's history put their names forward to be the 2020 nominee. Everyone had a theory about which direction the party should go and how they could avoid the same fate as the 2016 nominee. One of the important features of all the party conversations prior to 2020 was the downplaying of the carve-out states. That is, given the regional and demographic diversity of the candidates, perhaps one state might not speak for the whole party. Traditionally, the first one or two of the carve-out contest causes a great deal of winnowing, and candidates that don't place highly there or beat expectations find their support very quickly drying up, and they depart the race. But 2020, it was thought, might look different. Indeed, several pundits and scholars suggested it was possible that a different candidate could win in each of Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada and South Carolina, a prediction that was fairly close to true. And thus there would be no clear signal about whom the party was supposed to rally behind. Indeed, even after the New Hampshire primary in 2020, roughly 8 candidates still remained in the contest, which is more than we usually see at any point in previous cycles. There was a book that came out in 2008, a political science book called The Party Decides, which made the argument that party insiders, defined fairly broadly, tend to size up the presidential candidates long before the election year. And they generally reach a determination of which candidate they prefer. They then signal their support of that candidate through endorsements. And when they can agree on that candidate before the carve-out state contest, that candidate tends to win the nomination, regardless of who's ahead at that point in terms of fundraising or name recognition or anything else. We can think, for example, of 2000, when the field was mostly cleared for Al Gore and other potential candidates got the signal that it was just not their year to run. Or on the other side, when basically every sitting Republican governor endorsed George W. Bush and signaled to other would-be candidates that it wasn't the year for them. So that book came out in 2008, but it was catching the beginning of a trend that seems to be growing with time. In 2004 and 2008, a number of party insiders, that is, members of Congress, major donors, union leaders, local influential activists, and others, the sorts of people who usually back a candidate long before the first primaries and caucuses, they started to sit back and wait a bit. In 2004, some of them wanted to see if Howard Dean's campaign was going anywhere. In 2008, some of them wanted to see, they were clearly very fond of Barack Obama, but they wanted to wait until Iowa to see if he could actually win a contest. This pattern was very much on display in 2020. The 4 carve-out states didn't actually have that many delegates at stake. That is, less than 4% of all the pledged delegates that would be awarded at that point. Democratic insiders seem to be using them as what we might call beauty contests or proving grounds. They clearly liked several of the candidates who were running, but they wanted to see how they do across different constituencies and different contests. And then, of course, Super Tuesday was looming right behind them with 15 contests and more than a third of the available pledged delegates up for grabs. Many of these insiders were simply waiting until after the first 4 contests, but before Super Tuesday, to make a public decision. And we saw that play out in the endorsement patterns. So in the 3 days following the Iowa caucuses, some 4 prominent Democrats made endorsements. In the 3 days after New Hampshire, 6 of them made endorsements. In the 3 days after Nevada, 5 made endorsements. But in the 3 days after South Carolina, 38 prominent Democrats made endorsements. And perhaps most importantly in that cycle, the party's ultimate nominee in 2020 came into 4th in the first contest and 5th in the second. It wasn't until South Carolina that he won a contest. So what I'd like to encourage the members of this committee to consider as they go through this process is to think about just what they believe the problem is with the system up until now. In what I've been able to hear of many of these conversations, I've heard very few complaints about the quality of Democratic nominees. That is, Democratic leaders seem to be content for the most part with the choices that the party is making. And of course, the nominee is not necessarily the person who does well in those early contests. So then what is the problem? Is it that the current system is somehow unfair? Does it make it harder for some candidates to compete and easier for others? Is it somehow too open? Does it make it easy for candidates with very little shot at the nomination to compete and appear on debate stages with other more serious and credentialed candidates? Or are the concerns less about the candidates and more about the Democratic voters and caucus goers? One thing we know about the existing system is that wherever the carve-out contests are going to be, candidates and reporters and pundits and others are going to descend on that state for weeks or months or even years in advance of the contest. Presidential candidates will get to know many of the prominent local party figures and elected officials and interest group leaders there. They'll speak with and answer questions from and make promises to many of the rank and file Democrats there. Well, they'll end up knowing more about these states and their concerns than they will about many others. It would be useful if those states could be as diverse and broadly representative of different aspects of the party or of the country as possible. It's also, I'd say, possible to worry too much about this. That is, if we think back to the last nomination cycle in 2019 and 2020 and the candidate debates during those times, for the most part, people were focusing on and arguing about national issues: healthcare, Medicare for all, police violence, civil rights, Donald Trump's impeachment, sexual harassment, electability, and so forth. Surely the candidates were shaped somewhat by their experiences in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada and South Carolina, but overwhelmingly the contest was focused on national issues. That said, my impression is that it's useful to think about the carve-out states as a whole. That is, we're not really weighing the pluses and minuses of any given state. but rather deciding what set of demographics and interests are being represented across all 4 or 5, and making sure that the attention that those states get are broadly representative of the party. I hope these comments have been useful, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Veronica, do we see any questions?
I'm just looking. No, I don't see any questions. And I think that was our last. Oh, Frank Leon has a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for your comments and your excellent book. As you noted, this time around, the winner of the nomination and the current president came in 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire. There have been other times where those states really didn't make as much of a difference in terms of picking a winner. Perhaps maybe they made more of the difference in winnowing out other candidates. But do you think the 2020 experience diminishes the importance of those early states in showing that you can win it all and still do very poorly in Iowa and New Hampshire?
I think what those states showed is that those early contests offer a lot of symbolic values. They give a lot of other people in the party and in other states a chance to see the candidates, not just debating, not just going to different events and giving speeches, but also simply performing electorally. To get some sense, not just do they present themselves well, but can they bring organizers there? Can they actually convert their enthusiasm into votes? And, my impression is the people in the Super Tuesday states and the other states afterwards, find some value in that, and that's useful for people making decisions afterwards. But I don't know that, we're seeing that the carve-out states are necessarily that determinative. They do winnow out some candidates, obviously. But my impression is that their winnowing power may be on the decline.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, and I believe that Professor Masket was our last speaker.
In that case, I'm going to turn again back to my co-chair, Ms. Moore, for some final remarks.
Thank you so much, Jim. Members, that concludes our agenda for today's listening session. Before we go, are there any questions? If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature. I don't think we see any questions. Seeing no further. Oops, Veronica, I see you're lighting up.
No, I appreciate that, but no further questions.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, I want to thank you again. We also want to thank the staff and the production team, as well as our court reporter and the sign language interpreters who appeared on our live stream broadcast. Thank you all for participating in this process, and I'm looking forward to working with you over the next few months. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.